Okay, so today you guys are going to do solving square root equations part 2. It asks you to look at them graphically, but we're not going to graph them today because we don't want to graph that. That's kind of crazy. So what I did was I put the graphs on here for you, and I wonder if I opened the right one. Okay. So now I have the right one open. So we don't want to graph them. We don't want to look at them. We're not going to graph them by hand because they're kind of weird looking. But I graphed them for you. So this one is the first example. So that first graph where it has an x squared underneath the square root symbol is kind of a two-part graph. And then you can tell it has a square root across it that looks like it crosses it once. Okay? So let's talk about how we solve this. So it looks different today, right? It's got a squared. That's a little bit different. Other than that, the example is a lot like one of the ones we did yesterday. You have the square roots isolated on both sides of the equation. So we want to get rid of them, so we're going to square both sides. Square cancels out square root, and we're left with x squared plus 7x equals 13x plus 16. What kind of equation do you think that is? Very good. So if I want to solve a quadratic, that means I'm going to factor it and solve it. But first I have to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract my 13x and my 16. So they cancel over here. And now I'm going to make my list. So I have x squared minus 6x minus 16 equals 0. Okay, so from there I need to factor it. So I want to know what multiplies to make negative 16 and adds to make negative 6. Negative 8 and 2. Good. Negative 8 times positive 2 makes a negative 16 when you multiply, and when you add them together, you get negative 6. So here are my factors. And so now I need my solutions. What are my solutions if those are my factors? Right, inside or slide. So really you're just changing the signs. I've got negative 2 and a positive 8. Okay, so today's the day where we definitely want to check and make sure we don't have any extraneous answers. Okay, because on our graph it only looked like the square root crossed it once. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to plug in negative 2 into the original equation. So I've got the square root of negative 2 squared plus 7 times negative 2. And I want to know if that equals the square root of 13 times negative 2 plus 16. Okay, so you can do a lot of this work in your calculator because it's all numbers. Okay, but I don't have mine up here, so we'll square that negative 2. We get 4. 7 times negative 2 is negative 14 equals, on this side I'm going to get negative 26 plus 16. So I get the square root of negative 10 equals the square root of negative 10. Well, those are non-real numbers. Okay, so even though they appear to be equal, that means that that's an extraneous answer. Okay, because they're non-real. I'm not going to have the square root of negative 10. Let's plug in the other one. So that one's extraneous. So we're going to plug in the other one. Does the square root of 8 squared plus 7 times 8 equal the square root of 13 times 8 plus 16? So this one's going to give me 64 plus 56, which is, let's see, 120. This one's going to give me, what's 13 times 8? Let's see, 80 plus 24, 104, right, plus 16. So this one is the square root of 120. That one's good to go. Okay, it matches. The only reason this one's extraneous is because these are non-real numbers. So what you would do is cross it out of your solution set and write EXT, or extraneous. I just wrote extraneous because we're taking notes, but you could just write EXT. You always want to make sure that it's not extraneous. So when we look back at that graph, my square root really has two parts. I'm not sure if it'll let me write on it. It might. Okay, so it has two parts. This is where the non-real answers are. That other answer that's extraneous has to fall on the non-real portion. Okay, it's a little easier to see on the other graphs. So let's look at the next one. So the very first thing I want to do is isolate the square root. So I'm going to take that little minus x, and I'm going to add x to both sides. So now I have the square root of 5x plus 11 is equal to x plus 1. Now that the square root's isolated, we square both sides to get rid of the square root. So square root cancels out with square, but on this side, I also have to square it. So do you guys know how to square that expression, x plus 1? You have to FOIL it. Very good. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to FOIL. I get x times x is x squared. X times 1 is 1x plus 1x, so 2x in the middle. And on the end, 1 times 1. Okay, everybody comfortable with FOILing that? On this side, I bring down my 5x plus 11. Who said no? Okay. All right, so again, it's a quadratic equation. So you have to set it equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 5x, and we're going to subtract 11. If you need to step out, you can. I was talking to him back here. What multiplies to make negative 10 and adds to make negative 3? Anybody think of the factors? What two numbers do you think of multiplying to make 10? 2 and 5. And then what signs would they have to be? One of them has to be negative, right? Because they multiply to make a negative and they also add to make a negative. So it has to be the bigger one. So we have x plus 2 times x minus 5, which means my solutions would be what? Good. Negative 2, because insiders lie, and positive 5. It's kind of a crazy looking 2 there. There we go. So now I just have to go back and try them and make sure that I don't have an extraneous solution. So I'm going to plug in to my original equation. 5 times negative 2 plus 11 minus negative 2. So be real careful when you plug in behind subtraction. It's going to look like minus negative 2. So then we get negative 10 plus 11, and this becomes plus 2 equals 1. So the square root of 1 plus 2 equals 1. Is that a thing? No. Right? So that one tells me that that's extraneous. So I'd cross it out, write extraneous. It has to be on that non-real side. The other one, let's plug that one in. So the square root of 5 times 5 plus 11 minus positive 5 equals 1. So we get 25 plus 11 minus 5 equals 1. The square root of 36 minus 5 equals 1. 6 minus 5 equals 1. Good to go. And honestly, Caitlin, if I were plugging in that 5 and I set it up with all those numbers, I would use my calculator, okay? Maybe let's look at that for a second. So I'm kind of doing it by hand because I'm up here writing on the board, but what I would do is I just pull out my TI-84, and because it's all numbers, I would just plug it in. So second quit, and then let's see if it'll let me shrink it a little bit. There we go. So when you're plugging in the square root of 5 times 5 plus 11 minus 5, just use your second square root. And then, oops, let me move that out of the way. I have my 5 times 5 plus 11. Step off of my square root. Oops, I missed my 5. 5 plus 11. Step off of the square root. Minus 5. Now it's going to give me a decimal answer. Oh, no, it didn't. This is a whole number answer, sorry. So there's your 1. And then just, you already have it. It's just 1 on the other side. So I wouldn't do a lot of that by hand. I mean, you can set it up, plug it in on your paper, and then because it's all numbers, I would definitely do that on your calculator. Okay? I wouldn't spend a whole lot of energy on it, and you don't want to risk making a mistake. So let's look at number 6. I have to get the square root by itself. So what am I going to do first? Move that positive 8, good. So now I have the square root of x minus 4 equals x minus 6. Square both sides to get rid of square root. And then on this side, I'm squaring that expression. So I have x minus 4 is equal to x minus 6 times x minus 6. So we have to FOIL it. What do you get when you FOIL it? Good. Be careful on the end. Multiply again. Plus 36. Okay? Then we have x minus 4. So we want to set it equal to 0. So we're going to subtract this x, add this 4. Cancel, cancel. We get 0 equals x squared minus 13x plus 40. So what multiplies to make 40 and adds to make negative 13? What two numbers do you think of when you think of 40? Close, 5 and 8. Okay, how can they multiply to make a positive but add to make a bigger negative? They're both negative. Good. So my factors are x minus 5 times x minus 8, which means my solutions are insiders lie, 5 and 8. And then we just have to check them to make sure they both work. So for the first one, I have 8 plus the square root of 5 minus 4 equals 5 plus 2. So 8 plus the square root of 1 equals 5 plus 2. 8 plus 1 does not equal, 5 plus 2. Right? Gives me 9 and 7. So this one is extraneous. Then let's try the 8. God bless you. So we have 8 plus the square root of 8 minus 4 equals 8 plus 2. So 8 plus the square root of 8 minus 4, which is 4, equals 10. 8 plus 2, yep, it equals 10. Boom. So that one's good, and this one's extraneous. So today, the assignment's just a little bit longer because you have to remember to check and see if they're extraneous, but it has an answer bank.